He laughed when he said it, like it was a joke everyone should enjoy, and then he lifted his glass and called me a temporary mistake in front of his entire family, his voice calm, casual, like he was talking about the weather, not his wife of 3 years. And when the room filled with quiet chuckles, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a folder, and slid divorce papers across the table toward me, as if this had all been planned, as if I had always been something disposable, something meant to be corrected later. And I remember the sound the paper made against the wood, sharp, final, like a line being drawn under everything I thought we had, and no one stopped him, not his mother, not his brother, not a single person at that table. They just watched me, waiting to see if I would break, if I would cry, if I would beg, and I didn't. I just sat there, my hands still, my heartbeat slow, looking at the man I had once trusted and realizing I had never really known him at all. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now, because I want to know who is here with me in this moment. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 41 years old. And that night at my husband's family dinner was the night everything in my life shifted in a way I never saw coming. But to understand how I ended up sitting at that table, staring at divorce papers I didn't expect, you need to go back with me to where it all really began, long before anyone in that room decided I didn't belong. 3 years earlier, I met Daniel Carter in a place that did not match the life I came from, a quiet coffee shop just outside Fort Arlington where people came to sit alone, think, or wait for someone who mattered. And that day, I was not waiting for anyone. I was just passing through between assignments, wearing civilian clothes, keeping my head down like I always did when I was off duty, and he walked in like he belonged everywhere, confident but not loud, the kind of man who smiled first and spoke second. And somehow we ended up sharing a table because the place was full, and he asked politely if he could sit. And I said yes without thinking too much about it, and that was how it started. Not dramatic, not special, just two people sitting across from each other talking about simple things, work, travel, family, the kind of conversation that feels easy, like you have known someone longer than you actually have. And he never asked what I really did, not in a direct way, and I did not offer it. I told him I worked in logistics for the government, which was true, just not the full truth, and he nodded like that was enough, like he respected boundaries. And at the time that mattered to me more than anything, because my life was built on things people did not see, things I could not explain, and for once it felt good to be just Sarah, not colonel, not officer, just a woman sitting in a coffee shop talking to a man who looked at her like she was normal. And for a while, that was exactly what he did. He treated me like I was part of his world, not outside of it. He introduced me to his family early, said they were close, said they would love me. And I remember the first dinner at their house, the long table, the polished silverware, the way his mother Margaret watched everything without saying much, the way his brother leaned back in his chair like he was always judging something. And I remember thinking it felt formal, but not hostile, just different from what I was used to, because my world was structured, precise, built on rank and responsibility, while theirs was built on appearance, on who belonged and who did not. And I did not notice the shift right away. It was small at first. Little comments, little pauses, questions that sounded polite but carried something underneath. Like when Margaret asked where I studied and then smiled just a second too long when I answered. Or when Daniel's sister laughed softly and said I seemed very simple compared to the women they usually met. And I told myself it did not matter. Because Daniel stood beside me. He held my hand. He said they just needed time. And I believed him. Because I wanted to, because I had spent most of my life in environments where trust was rare, and I thought I had finally found something steady, something personal, something that did not require me to be guarded all the time. And when he proposed, it was quiet, just the two of us, no audience, no pressure, and I said yes without hesitation, because at that point I still believed what he showed me was real. I believed the way he looked at me in that coffee shop was the truth, and not the beginning of something that would slowly change, something that would turn into silence at the dinner table, into glances I could not quite read, to moments where I felt like I was being measured against something I could not see. And by the time I started to understand it, by the time I felt the distance growing in ways I could not explain, I was already part of that family, sitting at that same long table, wearing their last name, and thinking I just needed to hold on a little longer because I had no idea yet that to them, I was never meant to stay. After the wedding, I moved into Daniel's house, a large 2-story place about 30 minutes outside the city, with tall windows, a long driveway, and rooms that always felt slightly too quiet, like every sound carried further than it should. And at first I told myself it was just an adjustment, a new environment, a different rhythm. But the truth was, the feeling started almost immediately, subtle but constant, like something just beneath the surface that I could not fully name. And it showed up in small ways, the kind of things that are easy to ignore if you want to keep the peace, like how Margaret would rearrange the kitchen after I cooked, not saying anything, just quietly moving things back to where she preferred them, or how Daniel would correct me in front of his family over details that did not matter, the way I set the table, the way I spoke about work, the way I chose my words, always with a smile, always gentle, but always in a way that made it clear I was slightly off, slightly out of place. And I remember one evening, about 6 months into the marriage, when his brother made a comment during dinner, something about how I was lucky to have married into their family. And everyone laughed, not loudly, just enough for it to settle into the room. And I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, to push back, even just a small correction. But he did not. He just took a sip of his drink and changed the subject. And that was the first time I felt it clearly. Not confusion, not discomfort, but distance, like I was standing just outside a circle I thought I was part of. And after that, it became easier to notice the pattern, the way conversations would shift when I spoke, the way plans were made without including me, the way decisions about the house, about family events, about even small things were discussed around me, but not with me. And when I brought it up to Daniel, carefully, calmly, he would always say the same thing, that I was overthinking, that his family was just traditional, that I needed to give them time, and I wanted to believe him. I really did. Because leaving was not something I considered lightly, not after everything I had committed to, not after choosing him in a life where I was trained to calculate every risk, every outcome. But there were moments that stayed with me, moments I could not explain away, like the night Margaret asked me directly, with that same calm expression she always had, whether I planned to settle down properly and focus on being a wife instead of continuing a career that kept me away. And I told her that my work was not something I could simply step away from, that it was part of who I was. And she nodded slowly, like she understood. But then she said, almost gently, that some roles were more temporary than others, and that a family needed something more stable. And I remember the way the room went quiet after that, the way no one disagreed, and how Daniel placed his hand on the table but not on mine, not even by accident. And that was when the idea first took shape, not fully, not clearly, but enough for me to feel it, that in their eyes, I was not permanent, not truly part of what they had built, just someone passing through, someone who had not yet earned a place. And the more time passed, the more that feeling settled into everything, into the way they spoke, the way they looked at me, the way Daniel slowly started to mirror them without realizing it. Or maybe he did realize it. Maybe that was the part I did not want to face. Because admitting that would mean accepting that the man I met in that quiet coffee shop was not the man sitting across from me at that long dinner table anymore. And by the time the cracks became impossible to ignore, by the time the silence between us started to feel heavier than any argument, I was already living inside a reality where I was tolerated, not accepted, present, but never fully seen. And I still stayed, because I believed things could shift back, because I thought I could fix what I did not even fully understand. And because I had no idea yet just how far they were willing to go to prove that I did not belong, the shift did not happen all at once. It came in layers, quiet and controlled, the kind of pressure that builds slowly until you realize you have been standing in it for a long time. And I started to notice that Daniel's tone changed first, not in what he said, but in how he said it. Shorter answers, longer pauses, less eye contact, like he was already somewhere else, even when he was sitting right next to me. And there were nights when I would come home after long hours, still carrying the weight of decisions I could not talk about, and he would barely look up from his phone, just nod and ask if I had eaten, not because he cared, but because it sounded like something a husband should say. And I remember one evening in particular, the house was quiet, the clock on the wall ticking louder than usual, And I asked him directly if something was wrong, and he leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and said that his family was concerned, that they felt I was never really present, that I was always somewhere else, and I told him that my work required that it was not something I could explain in detail, and he nodded like he understood. But then he said something that stayed with me. He said that maybe they were right. Maybe I was not built for a normal life. And for a second, I did not respond. Not because I did not have words, but because I realized he was not defending me anymore. He was agreeing with them. And after that, the conversations became more direct, less careful. His mother started inviting people over without telling me. Guests who would ask polite questions about what I did, where I worked, and I would give the same measured answers. And they would exchange looks, subtle, quick, but enough to notice. And one afternoon, his sister asked if I even planned to stay long term, and I asked her what she meant, and she smiled, soft but sharp, and said that some people come into families as a phase, not as a foundation. And I remember standing there, holding a glass of water, feeling the cold against my hand, and realizing that they had already decided what I was. They just had not said it openly yet. And Daniel was there, leaning against the counter, hearing every word, and he did not correct her, he did not step in, he just stayed quiet. And that silence felt heavier than anything they had said out loud. And from that point on, everything became clearer. The way plans were made without me, the way decisions about holidays, finances, even small daily things were discussed like I was not part of the equation. And I started to understand that I was being positioned, slowly, carefully, as someone temporary, someone who could be removed without disrupting their structure. And I should have left then. I know that now. But at the time, I kept telling myself that things could still be fixed, that if I just stayed steady, stayed calm, stayed patient, it would shift back, because that is what I was trained to do. Hold position under pressure. Wait for the right moment. Do not react too early. But what I did not see was that they were not waiting, they were preparing, and Daniel, whether he realized it or not, was part of that preparation. And the night of that dinner, the one where everything finally broke into the open, did not come out of nowhere. It was built piece by piece, conversation by conversation, silence by silence, until there was nothing left to hide behind. And by the time I sat down at that table, with the plates set perfectly, the glasses aligned, the room filled with people who had already made their decision about me, I was not walking into a family dinner. I was walking into something that had been planned long before I ever understood what was happening. The moment after he pushed the papers toward me stretched longer than it should have, like time had slowed just enough for everyone in that room to study my face, to look for a reaction they had already decided I would have. And I could feel it, the expectation, the quiet anticipation, like they were waiting for confirmation that everything they believed about me was true, that I would fold, that I would argue, that I would prove I did not belong in their world. And Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression relaxed, almost relieved, like he had finally said something he had been holding in for a long time. And his mother reached for her glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down carefully, her movements precise, controlled, like this was just another step in a process she had already accepted as necessary. And then she looked at me, not with anger, not with emotion, but with something colder, something more final. And she said that it would be easier for everyone if I signed now, that there was no need to make things complicated. And I remember noticing the way no one interrupted her, no one even shifted in their seat, as if this had already been discussed, already agreed upon before I ever walked into that room. And I lowered my eyes to the paper for a second, not to read it, but to feel the weight of the moment, to understand exactly what they thought they were doing. And when I looked back up, Daniel was watching me closely, not with concern, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet certainty, like he was sure he had already won. And he said that this did not have to be difficult, that it was just a formality, just a correction, and the word stayed with me. Correction, like I was something that needed to be fixed, removed, replaced, and I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not hurt, something steadier, something clearer, like a line finally coming into focus after being blurred for too long. And I reached for the pen they had placed beside the papers, not because I was going to sign, but because I wanted them to believe I might, because I wanted to see how far they would go. And as my fingers closed around it, I noticed something else, something small but out of place. The way Daniel kept glancing toward the front door, quick, almost unconscious, like he was expecting something, or someone, and that was when the silence in the room changed, just slightly. Not enough for everyone to notice, but enough for me. And I followed that instinct, that same instinct that had kept me alive in situations far more uncertain than this, and I did not sign. I just held the pen above the paper, letting the moment stretch, letting the room stay suspended exactly where they wanted it. And then, from somewhere outside, I heard it, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the tires slowing over gravel, the engine cutting off, and for a second, no one reacted. But Daniel's eyes shifted again, sharper this time, and his mother's hand paused just above the table, and I knew then that this night was not unfolding the way they had planned, because whatever they thought was about to happen, whatever they believed they had complete control over, was about to change, and I set the pen down slowly, not signing, not speaking, just waiting, because for the first time that evening, I was no longer the only one in that room who did not know what was coming next. The room did not explode, no one shouted, no one moved, but something in the air shifted so completely that it felt heavier to breathe, and I remember the exact moment the front door opened, the quiet sound of it, controlled, deliberate, followed by footsteps that did not belong to anyone in that house, and every head turned at once, except mine, because I already knew what that presence meant, even before I saw him, and when Colonel James Whitaker stepped into the dining room, still in uniform, his posture straight, his expression calm but focused, the entire space seemed to tighten around him, and for a second no one spoke, not even Daniel, not even his mother, and then the colonel's eyes moved across the table, scanning faces, reading the room in a way only someone trained to do so could, until they stopped on me, and there was a pause, just a brief one, but long enough for everything to hang in place, and then he stepped forward and said my name, not softly, not casually, but clearly, formally, Colonel Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, and the sound of it cut through the room like something undeniable, something that could not be reshaped or ignored, and I watched Daniel's expression change in real time, the confidence draining from his face, replaced by something uncertain, something almost unrecognizable, and his mother's posture shifted, her hand tightening slightly around her glass, her eyes no longer steady, and no one laughed, no one spoke, because suddenly they understood that the version of me they had created in their minds did not match the reality standing in front of them, and I did not need to say anything. I did not need to explain, because the truth had already entered the room and taken its place, and in that silence, I reached for the papers again, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with clarity, and I signed them, calmly, without anger, without hesitation, because in that moment it was no longer something being done to me, it was something I was choosing, and when I placed the pen down, I did not look at Daniel, I did not wait for a reaction, I simply stood up, straightened my posture, and for the first time in that house, I felt completely aligned with who I was, not who they thought I should be, not who they tried to reduce me to, but who I had always been. And I walked out of that room without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that I needed to carry forward, and life after that night did not become perfect, it did not suddenly turn into something easy or simple, but it became clear, it became mine again. I moved into a smaller place closer to base, a place where the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy, where I did not have to measure my presence or justify my existence. And over time I realized that the hardest part was not leaving, it was understanding that I had stayed longer than I should have, ignoring the quiet signals, the subtle shifts, the moments when something inside me already knew the truth. And if there is one thing I have learned from all of this, it is that your value is not something other people get to define based on their comfort, their expectations, or their limitations, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to fight for a place where you are barely tolerated, but to walk away and choose yourself fully. And if you are listening to this and something in your life feels off, if there is a voice inside you quietly telling you that something is not right, do not ignore it. That voice is not weakness. It is awareness. It is protection. It is something deeper guiding you back to yourself. And you deserve to be in spaces where you are respected without conditions, where you are seen without having to prove your worth over and over again. And I know it is not easy, especially when emotions, history, and love are involved. But protecting your peace, your identity, and your independence is not selfish. It is necessary, and sometimes faith, whether you call it intuition, God, or simply the universe, shows you the truth in ways you cannot ignore forever. And when it does, trust that there is a reason. Trust that there is something better waiting on the other side of that clarity. And I want to thank you for listening, truly, because stories like this are not just about what happened. They are about what we choose to do after, about how we rebuild, how we heal, and how we move forward without losing ourselves again. And if any part of this resonated with you, you are not alone, not in what you feel, not in what you have been through. And I hope this reminds you that you have more strength than you think, more clarity than you realize, and more control over your life than anyone else would ever admit. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 41 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never let anyone convince you that your place in this world is temporary when you were never meant to shrink for them in the first place.